Chapter 9. Meeting a Challenge. The injured bareback rider tried to stand, but it was evident at once that her ankle was either badly sprained or broken. Her face was creased with pain as she put an arm around the shoulders of two men riders who helped her from the ring. Meanwhile, her horse had run to the exit. The remaining performers carried on, doing their best, but it was evident that the mishap had made them nervous. At a signal from the band, evidently inspired by croon, the act came to an abrupt end. The whip which had caused the accident had been kicked out of the way and seemed to have been forgotten by everyone but Nancy. She assumed that the performers thought some child had thrown it. The young sleuth herself was becoming confused. "I thought the person who tried to strangle me had it in for me personally," she mused. But what could have been his motive for injuring the circus rider? Recalling her first suspicions of the stableman at Roberto's riding academy, Nancy wondered if it was possible that Hitch had perpetrated all three bits of mischief. "Hitch did warn me not to do any circus riding," Nancy reminded herself. "Maybe he doesn't want other girls to either." As the next act was being announced, Nancy saw Chief of Police McGinnis of the River Heights force walk into the box which she had occupied the evening before. He was wearing civilian clothes. Getting up, she hurried over and seated herself beside him. "Hello, Nancy," he said genially. "What's the mystery this time? Whenever you seek me out, I know something's in the wind." Nancy smiled and confessed that she did have a problem. She asked if he had reached the circus in time to see what had happened to the young bareback rider. "No," the chief replied, "but the guard outside told me about the accident. Too bad. I was hoping the circus would get through their 3 days here without any trouble. But I suppose we have to expect such things." "It's my idea," Nancy said thoughtfully, "that it was a deliberate attempt to injure the girl and her horse." "What makes you think so?" the officer asked. Nancy told him what had happened to her the evening before with the very same kind of whip. The chief whistled. "Why didn't you tell me before now what happened to you?" he demanded. Nancy explained that Ned had spoken to the circus policeman. "And we did make a search for the man," Nancy replied. Chief McGinnis, who admired Nancy's prowess as a detective, remarked, "Since you couldn't find the man, it was probably because he skipped out." "I also had a threatening note from the strangler," Nancy went on. "I was going to bring it to you, but so many things have happened since then that I had no chance. I did look it over carefully, Chief, and couldn't find a clue to the writer." "Well," he said, smiling, "we'll call your findings the preliminary investigation. You bring the note to headquarters. I'd like to give it a microscopic test." Nancy promised to do so, then told Chief McGinnis her suspicions about Hitch. After she mentioned the stableman's warning to her about stunt riding and the incident of the stone throwing, the officer advised Nancy to be wary. "I certainly think that you have good reason for suspecting that fellow, Hitch," he said. "I'll put a detail on him right away." Nancy returned to her seat and concentrated on Lolita's act. The performance went off exceedingly well. As it ended, and Nancy was adding her applause to that of the enthusiastic crowd, an usher came up to her with a note. As Nancy started to open it, her breath came a little faster. Was this another warning? Had her mysterious enemy seen her talking to the chief of police? A moment later, the girl's fears were allayed. The note was from Dan Webster, asking him to meet him in his office at once. "Something very important has come up," the note said. Nancy arose and hurried from the tent. 100 thoughts flashed through her mind before she reached the office. What could he want of her? As she walked in, Dan Webster smiled and offered her a chair. Then, looking directly at her, he said, "I won't beat around the bush, Miss Drew. I want you to take the place of that injured bareback rider." Nancy was so amazed she opened her mouth and closed it again without speaking. Then she managed to exclaim, "You want me to take that girl's place?" "I told you this morning, Miss Drew, that you ride well enough to be in the circus." "But I can't perform like that girl," Nancy objected. "She's excellent. By the way, how is she?" Webster revealed that the young rider's ankle had been broken in the fall. It was questionable whether she would ever be able to perform the act again. "Oh, what a shame!" Nancy cried, then added, "Thank you for your compliment, Mr. Webster, but really I'll have to refuse. Even if I could do the riding, I know Mr. Croon would never approve of my joining Sim's circus." The horse trainer said he did not think the ringmaster would disapprove. Furthermore, Croon had given an ultimatum that the bareback act was to be filled in before the evening show, or the whole troupe would be dismissed. The actors might change their routine, but unfortunately the horses can't, Webster told her. It takes a long time to train them, and there's no changing them. Nancy felt sorry for the group that depended on the act for their livelihood. If she could ride for 1 or 2 performances until they found a replacement, it might help. Dan Webster took her silence as a sign of refusal. Leaning toward her, he said in a whisper, "Miss Drew, this might be your golden opportunity to solve the mystery of the circus. If you lived with us for a week or so, you could watch the croons at close range." This plea did the trick. Laughing, Nancy said that she would join the circus, provided her father approved. "He's on a trip, but I'll try to locate him," she promised. "I'm not sure where he is staying at present." "If you don't," Webster said, "I'll turn this old earth upside down to find him. Where do we start?" He pushed the telephone toward Nancy and insisted that she begin calling. First, she tried Mr. Drew's office, only to learn that they had not heard from him that day and did not know where he was. As she put down the phone, Lolita and Pietro walked into the office. Nancy was surprised to see them together, and Lolita must have guessed her thoughts. "We're becoming very bold being seen with each other," the circus star laughed happily. Pietro frowned. "But look for an explosion if Mr. Croon sees us." "Let's not worry," the aerialist said, and added that all her friends in the circus were acting as lookouts and would notify the couple at once if Lolita's foster father were close by. "Say," Dan Webster spoke up, "you two will have to help me out. Nancy Drew must take the place of Rosa. I have persuaded her, but she tells me she won't join the circus unless her father gives permission, and we can't locate Mr. Drew. What am I going to do?" Lolita walked over to Nancy and put an arm around the girl. "I think it would be nice for you to have your father's permission," she said. "But, after all, he doesn't object to your doing the circus riding at Senor Roberto's?" "No." "Then what's the difference whether you're riding in our ring or the one at the riding academy?" Lolita asked persuasively. "I don't suppose there is any," Nancy agreed, "but I'd still like to get in touch with him. I have an idea. 2 friends of mine who often work on mysteries with me will be glad to try to locate him, I'm sure. In the meantime, I'll practice some stunt riding. After all," she reminded the others, "I haven't ridden with the other members of the bareback troupe. The whole thing might be a flop with me in it." "Oh, no, it couldn't be!" Lolita cried excitedly. Dan Webster said that the equestrian group were meeting in 20 minutes to decide what to do about the act. If Nancy would come to the main tent at that time, he would introduce her and let them see her work. "I'll find you some riding clothes, Nancy," Lolita offered. "Come on." Before leaving the office, Nancy telephoned to Bess and George, who she knew were at Roberto's academy. They were overwhelmed to hear that their friend planned to ride in the circus. Bess begged Nancy to reconsider, but finally she promised to help locate Mr. Drew. "Thanks a million," said Nancy. "And hurry, won't you?" "Express service." George laughed as she put the telephone down. Nancy and Lolita left Webster's office with Pietro. They had gone only a few steps when one of the midgets rushed up to Lolita.
"Your father's coming,"
he warned her. With that, Pietro dodged behind a truck. The two girls went on. A moment later, they were confronted by Croon. "Who is this, Lolita?" he asked sternly. Giving Nancy a piercing look, he asked, "Aren't you the girl who let that kid sneak a ride in Cinderella's carriage during the parade?" The ringmaster did not wait for Nancy to answer. His eyes flashing, he ordered her to leave the circus grounds at once. Then, turning to Lolita, he snapped, "Get to your trailer, and don't come out until supper time." Over Croon's shoulder, Nancy could see Pietro beckoning to her. His sign language seemed to indicate that she was to pretend to leave and that he would follow and meet her later. After bidding Lolita goodbye, Nancy started off. Croon stood there until he was sure his daughter had obeyed his command. Then he walked away. A short distance farther on, Pietro caught up to Nancy. He offered to guide her to the trailer where extra costumes were kept, including riding habits. Nancy shook her head. "It wouldn't be safe now, Pietro. I suspect that Mr. Croon knows who I am and that I have solved mysteries. I think he referred to Teddy as an excuse for ordering me to leave. He doesn't want me around here and will do anything to keep me away." Pietro looked crestfallen. After a moment of silence, he said, "Even so, Nancy, you must stay and see what you can do for Lolita and me. Listen, I'm going to tell you something that I don't even dare tell my fiancé. She would be worried sick. I was walking past Mr. and Mrs. Croon's trailer a little while ago. I believe they thought nobody was around. Mrs. Croon was crying and saying to her husband, 'The money won't do us any good if people find out where it came from.'" Nancy was startled. "Have you any idea what Mrs. Croon meant?" she asked the clown, but he shook his head. Nancy's mind jumped to a possible conclusion. The Croons might have secretly gained possession of money which did not rightfully belong to them. End of chapter 9.